Hello and welcome to UMD Media's weekly show, the H panel, on a new day and new time. Sundays, every Sundays, weekly at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm very happy to be back with the whole panel today, and I'm joined by Duke Burbridge, Faisal Roble, and Skel Gabisa. The topic for the day is current war and peace state of Ethiopia, and that will give us an opportunity, I believe, to cover what has happened and has been happening both in northern Ethiopia, Tigray, and western Ethiopia. Actually, I should say the entire Oromia, and now in Somali region as well. So we'll start as usual with the what stood out, what was the highlight for each panelist. And our topic today, as I said, is current war and peace state of Ethiopia. Those who have joined us live online, welcome and Happy New Year. And those who are also following us on the satellite in the Horn of Africa, this is H panel of UMD Media. Welcome, gentlemen. And Faisal, we'll start with you today. And you have been to the Horn of Africa recently. Maybe we'll touch on based on that as well. So, what stood out? What was the highlight for you? Maybe we can expand more than a week because we haven't been doing this for a number of weeks. Faisal.
Yeah, thank you very much, Getacho, and very happy to be with my colleagues who kind of became like family for the last 2 years. Yeah, I was in the Horn of Africa, particularly Nairobi and Djibouti. I think the region is integrated both politically as well as in terms of the fear, the insecurity, the famine, the hardship that is taking place. The region feels wherever you are, whether you are in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, in Nairobi, particularly people of Ethiopian extraction are feeling the burden when you see Ethiopians in Djibouti or in Nairobi, really, particularly people who have been displaced to Oromo, Tigray, and to a certain extent the Amara, because they gravitate toward each other when they're at places like Nairobi. And you can tell that some people became displaced a few years ago and they became parents, so the refugees are in them. I think one highlight in my trip was when the Nairobi's to December 22nd, 2022 meeting took place, and the delegation from from the two sides, from the Ethiopian side and from the TPLF TDF side, were having a lunch. I was fortunate to be there and meet with some of them, and I wrote an article both for Warden News and for the Wash Post. And basically, my reflection was how it is very easy to make war and peace by the same people. These people were the people who were on both sides, making decisions until 600,000 people died. An entire economy has been, really brought down to demise. At the same time, they're the same people who are making now the current fragile peace, if you will. So the proximity of the decision-making process, both for peace and for war, really kind of captured me. And I'm saying so because I saw how these people were camaraderie to each other. When they're outside the camera, they really know each other. They gravitate toward each other. They socialize. They were, like a family feud, finally getting a chance. I think, like many of you, and we will get in depth into this discussion, I see the peace meaningless. The Tigray peace would be meaningless if the Oromo conflict is not quickly addressed. And I'm saying so because the Oromo conflict has already spread beyond the western Oromia and Walaga. It's now in eastern Oromia, particularly in the old Bali area and Harar. And the war that I mentioned that's taking place 8 kilometers outside Jigjiga has a very dynamic relationship with what's happening in Eastern Oromia. I think, in a nutshell, I will come back to that issue, but there is an intent on the part of Abiy and Shimalis to expand the conflict and take the attention of the Oromo masses away from what's happening and create an enemy out of nothing, which is what we know happened in Tigray and all that area. So this is a designed conflict, but this designed conflict had roots in the past, and I'll come back to that later on. But I think with the big picture, Ethiopia's peace is fragile, and two things make fragile. One is, as I said, you cannot have peace in Tigray and war in Oromia. Not only war, but war that's adding intensity and futility on a daily basis. You cannot have your cake and eat it. That's one. Secondly, according to the Economist, the Eritrean factor in Tigray. As long as Eritrea is recalcitrant and does not want peace to come into the area, it won't happen. This article is mentioning basically how it is time to, either silence Isaias or forget the whole peace. And basically, it's arguing that you cannot have peace in Tigray and, for that matter, in Ethiopia, as long as Isaias is the lone dictator in the region and the warmonger in the region. And I think there is a sense among Westerners and many quarters that are decision makers to finally call a spade and say that with Isaias, pulling the pulse, you cannot have peace in Tigray, but at the same time in Ethiopia. And I think with that I will stop and probably will come back to some of the local issues. But those two things, the interrelationship between the war in Tigray, the war in Oromia, and now spilling over to Somalia and the Eritrean factor, those are really the issues that capture our attention.
Great. Thank you, Faisal. Reminding our viewers that we are discussing over 70 days after the signing of the Pretoria Peace Agreement in Pretoria, and then a couple of rounds of meetings in Nairobi. Ezekiel, I want to come to you, and again, expanding beyond 7 days or a week, what is the highlight for you in terms of what has been happening in different parts of Ethiopia?
I guess now, since the Tigray war has now at least the guns have been silenced, as they say in Pretoria, we are now about to see what the level of destruction, the human cost, it's going to come out in the last how many years? 3 years. We were unable to really see the level of the brutality and the destruction, the mayhem, because of the communications blackout that was placed on Tigray by the Ethiopian government. But I just wanted to focus on one specific event that occurred in the last 5 years, but it probably captures what I was just trying to say. Keep in mind, Adwa doesn't know what was happening in Aksum at the time because of the lack of communication. The rest of the world was able to learn a few things about the devastation of the war, but to the fullest extent, the full extent of what was happening. It was simply some highlights of what was going on in Tigray for 2 years that we were able to learn. In the coming weeks and in the coming months, what we will learn is going to shock us much more than we have been shocked. And the one event where I was able to see that we're really in for a big shock is the visit of Tigrayan athletes to Tigray. I found that an interesting story. They arrived in Mekelle to be reunited with their families. The scene at the Mekelle airport was poignant. It was really heartbreaking. Ethiopia is not new to civil war. Civil war is the hallmark of Ethiopia. With the exception of the 27 years of relative calm and relative peace during, ironically, the time that the country was led by the TPLF, or the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front-led coalition, the EPRDF. Conflict has always been, basically the identity of Ethiopia. It's the Horn of Africa, mainly because of Ethiopia is known as the very unstable region. But never in the history of the country have families were made to endure enforced separation because of the conflict. If active conflict kept families and relatives apart, it was only for the duration of the conflict. Once the active conflict was over, families could reunite, even as the larger war was going on. But or at the same time, families could also keep still in communication through telephone and other means of communication, even when there was several civil wars going on in the country. But under the current Prosperity Party government and its decision to keep an entire region and the 6 million people that are in it for 800 years under siege, nearly all Tigrayans outside Tigray, athletes or non-athletes, were unable to maintain regular contact with those outside of their region. Some athletes, the ones that actually were competing for Ethiopia, didn't have information about their parents, whether they were alive, their siblings were dead or alive or wounded. They did not know. The scene at Mekelle showed the depth of the brutality of this war, because some athletes did not know whether their mothers are alive, whether their siblings were alive. They weren't able to know. It's only some of them that they were surprised at the airport. The brutality, the atrocity that the PP government, in conducting this civil war against Tigray, the choice and the tactic the tactic of war showed itself at the Mekelle airport, how brutal that this war was on families and those non-combatants who are not actively engaged in war. Now, not knowing how your parents are doing, or whether they're dead or alive, or the resultant stress that would obviously may occur, or would obviously make it difficult for the athletes to continue training, much less do well in international competitions. If you remember, in Ethiopia won a total of 10 medals at the 18th World Athletics Championships in Eugene, Oregon, making Ethiopia only second to the United States in the overall medal count. That was the first time that this happened to Ethiopia, that it came second to the United States. Now, 3 of the 4 gold medals that Ethiopia won, and 1 of the silver medals, were won by Tigrayan athletes, Lettesembet Gidey, Gotitom Gebreselassie, and Gudaf Tsaggai. This is an extraordinary performance under an extraordinarily stressful circumstances. Now, beyond that, these young women, beyond winning the competition and performing extraordinarily well, they created a counter narrative showing that the brutality unfolding in their region was unable to stop them from proving that they can excel. It is a story of resilience. It's a story of having an iron will, which underscores that the Tigrayan motto, the battle cry, Tigray prevails, is actually true. There is also subscript into this story. There were 2 confusing stories that came out on that day. One is when the athletes arrived in Mekelle, There was also an inexplicable travel restriction banning Tigrayans aged 16 to 65 from leaving the Alula Bagana Naga airport. The other is the story of Tigray, the Tigrayan forces who fought for 2 years against Ethiopia, handing over heavy weaponry to the national army that was brutalizing them only 70 days ago. Now, that is really what stood out for me. But one of the interesting, yeah. So this is the scene at Mekelle, but it also told a bigger story, a much larger story, that the Tigrayans who were doing everything under very difficult circumstances to and fighting in the athletic arena for Ethiopia under the same colors that the Ethiopian National Defense Forces were carrying as they were taking that brutal war to Tigray. It is a story of a mix of pride and agony. It's a pride of achievement and the pain of the agonizing reality that the athletes were for a long time were enduring, that they were prevented for a long time from sharing their achievements with their loved ones by authorities of the country whose banner they hoisted so high and the world, so that the world could take notice. And I'm sure that the confusion that we saw there, the confusion of pride and agony, shows that the war is not really over. There is much more stories of brutality that is going to come out, and that is really what stood out to me this week.
Thank you, Professor Eskel. We have learned that one of the athletes, Professor Eskel mentioned, Gudaf Sagai, went all the way with the delegation to Magala, but she was not able to see her parents because her parents happened to live in the region, the area of Adwa and Aksum, which is still under Eritrean forces. And we have also learned one of the coaches who went all the way to Magala, learned in Magala that his dad died a few weeks ago for lack of medication. So these are relatively, like Professor Eskel said, celebrities of the country, the nation, but were also victims of this genocidal war. Thank you for that. Duke, I know you have been following specifically the humanitarian aspect of all this closely. You have your own show, the Tigray Humanitarian Update. And again, it has been weeks since we came into the panel. So welcome again. What stood out for you? What's the highlight for you, Duke?
Well, I mean, the highlight, if we go back weeks, the highlight is the humanitarian delivery, restarting in Tigray. There's been some significant progress in about half of the region, but the half that hasn't gotten food has been the worst off. These are the areas of Tigray that were invaded twice, that were occupied twice, that were in very difficult positions before the peace agreement started, and they still haven't gotten food. So the progress that's been made as far as the humanitarian response has been something that it's worth protecting. It's worth protecting for the peace agreement. It's worth, a serious consideration by anybody, the TPLF or anybody in the international community. You want to make sure that food keeps getting to them. But the main issue here is that the places that were blocked off before, they're still blocked off. And the celebration around humanitarian aid restarting and, these positive things happen, it seems like as far as the international community goes, they're not paying attention to the suffering people of the central zone, the northwest zone, and the upper areas of the eastern zone, or the Europe, and those areas up there that are still blocked. And in the case of the eastern zone, they're being blocked by Eritrean forces, and that appears to be the case in the central zone. It appears to be the case in the northwestern zone. So at some point, somebody's going to have to adhere to the peace agreement and get food to these people. It was specifically said in the peace agreement that food, humanitarian assistance, be made available to everyone who needs it. And that is simply not happening. And so we've been watching every week to make sure to see where the distribution has gone, where the deliveries have gone. There are a number of sources of information on this, and all of them agree on one thing. The people of the central and northwest zone are not getting very much aid. Some of the aid that's going to the northwestern zone is not making it very far. The areas along the border with Eritrea are still blocked off. We still have a blockade more than 2 months into the peace process. And I can't say that this is going to sink the peace deal, because you want to think that, but there's nothing, they can detach it from what's happening on the ground to we need to keep peace at all costs. But this should put a pause in the international community's rehabilitation efforts for Ethiopia and the prime minister right now. They need to keep in mind that people are still being deliberately starved in Tigray after the peace process, after the peace agreement was signed in Pretoria, after the implementation program was signed, after they said that they were going to have a roadmap to an immediate resumption of humanitarian aid, which should have been an indication that they needed a roadmap to something immediately. But this is still going on. And so there's been a lot of backlash, I think, against some of the diaspora, against some of the people who are advocating for the people of Tigray. They need to really understand that they're not going to stop caring about the family members who are still blocked off. These guys are internally displaced. They've been displaced more than one time. They came to those who did not make it to the capital that are in Axum or Adwa or Shire or even further north. They got there with nothing. They didn't have enough food to camp out for 2 months. They need food right now. And the fact that that's not happening, it gets more urgent every day. So that's what stood out for me the past couple of weeks.
Great. Thank you, Duke, for that. For our viewers, Central Tigray is outside Mekelle, the most dense area of Tigray. So we are talking about millions of people. Sometimes if you look at the percentage, it might even give a different picture. So that's a very important highlight. So let's go to the topic, current war and peace state of Ethiopia. As we speak, this week has seen that the French and German foreign ministers were in Ethiopia. And of course, Arakilo reported it in a different light versus what the European foreign minister said about their meeting and so on. So maybe we start with your article as well, from Tokyo restaurant in Nairobi, and with a very excellent article you wrote, Faisal. You highlighted how important it is in terms of meeting the requirements in terms of humanitarian aid, connections, and accountability, and so on. But there are many people, at least in Tigray, who are worried that maybe what Pretoria and Nairobi are doing is just pushing accountability and justice to the back burner. So maybe start us off with what you're reading of War and Peace in the state of Ethiopia, not only in Tigray.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the Tigray War, in my opinion, and historians will be talking about this for a long time, is a savage war. When I say a savage war, it was conducted in a way that was, very inhuman. And I think Scale touched that, uh, described it, and I describe in my article some of the pictures and scenes that no human being uh, can forget. I think I'll come back to this, Getachew, if you don't mind. Uh, but I think the war that we have witnessed uh, destroyed 27% of Ethiopia's GDP. We're already a small GDP compared to 120 million, only $100 billion. $27 billion is what's now assessed that requires reconstruction. And 2.3 million kids in Tigray were out of school for about 2 years. Majority of that being young girls. This was the chance already young girls had, and that chance was even narrowed more and more. And you know how education access for girls in Africa is important. Not to mention the fact that basically, as Abiy said in his early days of the war, we will make Tigray the same as his hometown, which is a tiny village. Basically, he was saying, I'll take back Tigray 100 years. I don't think we can even fathom and discuss the destruction and mayhem that has been bestowed on the Tigray people. And anybody who touches that, like Scale was doing or Duke was doing from the food point of view, it's just a scratch. As we go deeper into openness, probably we'll find more and more. So now, the Pretoria / Nairobi peace, in my opinion, had one big umbrella framework, and everything is on the job training or learn as you go. The big framework was cessation of hostility. Let the bloodletting stop. People were dying, and I think if you recall Tsarkan's last presentation to Heritage and other diplomats, basically it was Tigray was on the cliff of being totally annihilated, or Tigrayans to fight till the last man, with Eritrea amassing its weapons, Abiy literally bringing everything that he had, close to 100 to 1 million soldiers descending on Tigray. It was an Armageddon that they wanted to put on Tigray. Now, with pressure, thanks to Mike Hammer, as well as I'm hearing, and I have no respect for Africa Bureau of Washington, who has been very biased when it comes to the issue. I think the framework was how to stop the blood and how to stop the war, and I think that has been reached. Now, in a normal situation with cessation of hostilities and peace building, everything would be worked prior to that, including the dismantling the war and the war machines and what have you. But I think that is not done. This one, they go and they make policies and implementation program as we go, and that's what I learned from what I have observed in Nairobi. And you can tell what's happening while the carnage is taking place, while people are still suffering from the siege of food and medicine. At the same time, we are seeing a glimmer of little hope here and there. That indicates to me that implementation program was not set from the get-go, but they are plugging the void as we go. There are very serious issues for the people of Tigray, and I think we touched that a little bit. How do they swallow this? How do they swallow the level of destruction and death that their own government brought onto them? How do they rationalize the hero coming out of Tigray in the form of sport when her mother was dying from lack of medicine? How do they reconcile this part of the Tigrayan persona? How do you really tell the Tigrayan hero that remain hero for Ethiopia and not for Tigray? I mean, these are generational issues. This would require psychological study. This would require political analysis and what have you. I think what's important here for me and for the mass of the Tigray region is who is responsible for the mayhem? Who will pay the price? Would it be people like Indargacho and Burhanu Naga, who have given the intellectual weapon for Abiy to rationalize the war? Would it be Diakon what's his name? Kibret,
Daniel,
Daniel Kibret,
Daniel.
who justified the war on the basis of religiosity and called it Tigrayans cancer and weed to be, to be wiped out of, or the Fano soldier who said that we should never hear the name of these people and they should never come back, even like goats. That's what he said. Even like goats, they shouldn't be born. Who should be responsible? Aret Kilo, their intellectuals, their ideologue, their soldiers and generals, that may be swept under the rug because of the need for peace building and peacemaking, but that will not satisfy the average Tigrania mother who lost two sons, or the young hero whose mom or father died while they were representing Ethiopia in the international arena. There has to be a process that's independent of Ethiopia that goes after the perpetrators of this huge international, never seen in Africa crime. That's the only way that the average non-politician Tigray person can probably say this will not happen again. Like the Jews said, never again. The Tigray masses and other Ethiopians probably need a phrase and a framework that will say never ever again. We don't have that now. Will the world cooperate with Ethiopia and the Tigrania administration to really see this happening? We don't know that. We already know that Prime Minister Abiy and his team would like to completely wipe out that history that's sitting in front of us, and probably they will seek the help of TPLF, TDF, and that's why I said perhaps. And in this show some time ago, I said perhaps there may be a wing of TPLF and PP hunting down those Tigranians who want to stand for human rights and for accountability. We don't know. We don't know. That's too early to say, but let's hope that there would be an independent process that will go after this. In terms of Eritrea, I think Abiy just cut his own for the sake of a quick gain to beat and defeat TPLF TDF. Abiy went to bed with a devil that he can never eject from that bed, and that's Isaias. And that's what the article in that Economist hinges on. Isaias, for those of us who grew up in the late 70s, know that he had in every movement in the Horn of Africa, he had his hand, whether it's Oromo Liberation Front, TPLF, EPRP, EDU, and what have you. In those days, in most of the case, Isaias's hand was in the right corner of that struggle. Lately, he became a war entrepreneur, and part of being a war entrepreneur gave Isaias a chance to really have an access to Aret Kilo. Now, ejecting him from Aret Kilo and from Tigray would require Abiy to stand up like a man and say, we had a fight, we had a war, a family war in Tigray, that's finished, we want you to go out. Abiy has not said that for various reasons, one of which is he is indebted to him and he's probably afraid, but I think in my opinion it's more of a fear of Eritrea's military muscle and fear of Eritrea's capacity to utilize Amhara ultra-nationalists and all the Gimbot 7 who are still around. What would Abiy do to Isaias? He has only one chance: to bring the rest of Ethiopia together, to bring Ola into some sort of resolution to their issue, to bring TPLF TDF on board, stop the war that's now spread out all over, including Somali region, and then see a strategy that has an Ethiopian content to see how to deal with Isaias. Abiy will not be sleeping a quiet sleep as long as Isaias is sitting in Asmara. Now, Isaias may have another card beyond Ethiopia, and that would be a card to revive Somalia's army, Somalia's capability, and create a different front that is now centered in Asmara that brings Somalia and other discontented groups who may be around, such as Somali groups. Today, ONLF released a press that really expressed for the second or third time how frustrated they are with PP and the PP regime. On top of that, three groups, including OLF, Cause for Somali, Congress for Somali Cause, and FAB, all Somali groups met in Nairobi and basically also agreed that they have been cornered and they have to find other means to gain their rights. Isaias is sitting on the corner. All these groups are potential allies of him. If he loses on the Northern Front and the Amhara ultra-nationalist groups and Aret Kilo, then he can go to the east and start another model where he can fight Ethiopia. Ultimately, Isaias's existential politics depends on weakening, dividing, and making Ethiopia constantly at war. And that's why we have a state of war today in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Faisal. For those who are asking for Faisal's article, we have just posted it on the comment section, so you can find the link there. Still, in Faisal's article and in many of your engagement as well, there is a mention that the war in Oromia or on Oromia has started way before the war on Tigray, but there has been no much coverage as we saw it. And then after the peace agreement was signed in Pretoria, we have seen an escalation on the war on Oromia, including drones. I don't think I know of any drone attack on Oromia before the war on Tigray, but now it has been used extensively in Oromia as well. So can you speak to what has been happening over the past weeks and now where we are in terms of specifically the humanitarian aspect as well, the attack on civilians in Oromia? Pascal?
Yeah, almost as the Ethiopian government and the Tigray government delegates were deliberating in Pretoria, the war in Oromia started to escalate. Drones were used mainly around Addis Ababa. Now keep this in mind. In the world, and everybody that is interested in Ethiopia needs to pay attention to where the area of operation is for the Oromo Liberation Army. It is not way in the west, bordering the Sudan border. That's where it was 4 years ago. But today the conflict is in West Shawa, that is to the district or the administrative zone west of Addis Ababa. It is in the Arra area in North Shawa, which is north of the capital city. It is in Boset, where yesterday and the day before there were engagements in which I think yesterday about 55 government soldiers were killed. Only one survived the engagement. Today, the same. There are also commando units that are actually operating in Addis Ababa itself, but we don't get any report about it. But in the rest of Oromia, of course, everybody knows that in the Wallagga area, which is west of the capital, war had been raging for 4 years. The Ethiopian National Defense Forces have organized campaigns to obliterate as they say, to wipe out the OLA once and for all. They have done that 3 times. One in January 8 to February 8, a month-long campaign where they have turned off internet, all communications, electricity, and placed that area under command post. For 4 years, there was conflict in that area. But now the conflict had spread to the RC region. First, it's like a concentric circle. First, I was just talking about the area around Finfinne, around Addis Ababa, the west for 4 years. Right now, because there is a resurgence of Oromo Liberation Army operation in the RC region, the government had gone after young people, uh, uh, imprisoning them, beating them. What will happen because of government operations in the RC region, making it difficult for young men and women to live? The number of the Oromo Liberation Army in that area, where the area of operation had not been a part of it, is going to grow. And it's going to connect with the operation in the south, in the Guji area, where a couple of days ago, Oromo Liberation Army went into Bulehora prison in the Guji region. They went and attacked the prison. And according to the OLA, about 2,000 political prisoners were released. And according to the PP governor of that zone, that administrative zone, 500 were released. Now, the difference is, of course, one could take a guess, but the government accepts that 500 prisoners were released by the Oromo Liberation Army. And in the east, there is also some regrouping and the beginning of activities in the east, in Karamille, in Machara area. So this is spreading, is my point. The operation is spreading, and there is a noose around Addis Ababa. What worked in Tigray was the siege. What worked in Tigray was the 800 days old siege. That is really what made the Tigray resistance that wore and ground them down. You can't do that in Oromia. There is no force. There is absolutely no force. Not the hollowed out Ethiopian military, not the Ethiopian military that has all kinds of heavy machine guns, light machine guns, and other artilleries and even drones, but has no ammunition to fire. So all of this is against the government in Addis Ababa, and is not going to be able to lay that siege that worked in Tigray in Oromia. What will happen is the siege of Addis Ababa. So there is an escalating war. But let me speak to the idea that Faisal wrote, that the war actually started in Oromia. To some extent, that is true, to the extent that only 6 months into this prime minister's tenure as prime minister, that is when the threat against OLA started. That's when it started. To the extent that the verbal threat and the army generals, the military men even testifying before Congress saying that they're going to wipe out the OLA, to that extent, of course, the war started in Oromia. To the extent that the use of cutting off internet communications and then perpetrate unspeakable atrocities against their own citizens, to the extent that also started in Walaga, in Oromia. Yes, the war started in Oromia, but the problem in that area, all of the problems that country is suffering, emanates from the Amhara region. That is where the fascistic, expansionist, exclusivist forces are residing. Those are the ones that have occupied Tigrayan land in the south and in the west, and now refusing to leave. That's where it starts. Again, it is that region that is now sending all kinds of armed militias, government forces into Oromia and killing people, beheading people, flaying people, all kinds of atrocities that belongs to biblical times is being perpetrated from forces that come from the Amhara region. But it is the Amhara region that in 2018 actually started the scorched earth policies of ethnic cleansing, of genocide against the Command people. It actually started this genocide, the act of genocide, started against the Command people in Chilga, in Aikal, in West Gondar. So this thing has genesis in a number of places. There are so many conflict areas. But let me say this, and I'll really stop because I've been speaking too long. the opening salvo of the conflict in Tigray, but also the civil war all over, because there is no area of Ethiopia where there is no conflict. Benishangul, Oromia, Tigray, Amhara, Gumuz, southern regions, and Afar and Somali regions, everywhere there is conflict. There is no area, there is no region of Ethiopia that is not, where there is no active conflict. All of this started because on June 20, and this is something that I learned from a conversation with a friend, on June 2018, the day that an assassination was attempted on Abiy Ahmed on Meskel Square. On that day, he went to the palace and he said, I quote, I translated from Amharic, say, "Together we will eliminate our enemies and build a united and strong Ethiopia." Together with who? Together with who? What we didn't know what he was talking at that time is that on the same day, Isaias was celebrating or presiding over Eritrea's Martyrs' Day. And it is that day, Isaias, that gave a speech in which he said, we have accepted the invitation from Ethiopia. I will send delegates to Addis Ababa to begin the peace process. But also at the same time, he said, and Wayane, game over. That's when it started, on the same day. The opening salvo of the conflict that morphed into a civil war that has now engulfed all parts of Ethiopia started on June 20, 2018, because Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki they chose to fight that war. As long as Isaias is in Ethiopia, and when I say in Ethiopia, I don't really mean in Tigray. As long as Isaias is everywhere in Ethiopia, there is really little chance that this war is going to end. The hope that Abiy Ahmed is going to tell Isaias Ahmed, pack up and go, it's not going to happen as far as I'm concerned. So the war started there. If you want to trace it back to the roots, that's the day. They made a war of choice. And after genocide, after hollowing out Ethiopia's military, after devastating Ethiopia's economy, everything that Ethiopia has, its people, its culture, and its politics, it's kind of very difficult that Abiy is going to now understand the forces that he unleashed are beyond his own control.
Thank you, Scale, for that chronology and route where everything started. One point that I want, when you come back later for the second round or the final thought, to touch upon is the Field Marshal Burhanu Jula recently, maybe this week, spoke with ISAT, and he was asked why they couldn't defeat OLA. He said the ANDF has never been, in that war with OLA in Wollega and so on. He said his forces were busy with northern Ethiopia, so everything was done by the Oromia regional state forces. So I just want to fact check that with what we know when you come back maybe later. Duke, I just want to show you, or to show our audience, what happened on June the 12th, January the 12th. This is Abiy Ahmed tweeting, "Today I have met with Catherine Colonna, France Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, and Annalena Baerbock, Germany's Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs." And he's talking about how, the bilateral Ethiopia and France and Germany, all that, and so on. On the same day, the Associated Press News reported that how that meeting went. So it talks about how France and Germany urge Ethiopia on accountability after war. So again, we're talking about current world peace state of Ethiopia. How is the United States, Europe, and everyone else in the international community reading what's happening in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I mean, this is that's a little bit of what I alluded to about the attempt to rehabilitate um, the prime minister. The I think the United States is taking a little bit of a step back. They don't seem as eager as some of the European countries to rush in to try to restart some sort of economic partnerships, or to not restart, because in many cases they never stopped, really. They just stopped talking about them. But the way Europe has come back and tried to, get in to make sure that they have some influence there, look for economic opportunities, of course, is going to be, I think it's a very bad idea, because as we're talking about Oromia, and some of the stuff that Faisal was saying, some of the stuff that Professor Esco was saying, is when you look at how do you reconcile what has been allowed to happen in Tigray with moving forward with any sort of confidence that that's not going to happen in Oromia. Now, understanding that to try to block off Oromia the way you blocked off Tigray, that's not gonna work, of course. But I saw a comment not long ago, a couple of days ago, worried about, are they going to use the same tactics in Oromia? And I think, as we just heard, some of the tactics that they were using in Tigray were being used in Oromia even before Tigray. But the recent document that came out by the Bureau of Agriculture and something else, of farming, essentially, in Tigray, was sort of outlining some of the damage that has been done in the rural areas, in the farming areas of Tigray. And if they do that in Oromia, it's not going to. I don't know how they'll feed their country. Like, you'll be looking at collapse if the same sort of just terrorizing the farmers, destroying farming equipment, stealing farming equipment, killing livestock, mixing seeds with sand, mixing the seed stock with sand. Some of the stuff was cruel, some of it was opportunistic, some of it was illegal, but it was all just. I mean, this is we've known about this, the tactic of just bringing the agriculture system to its knees in Tigray. And this is created, and when you look at the drought that's coming, or that's already been there, 6 straight bad raining seasons, when you look at global hunger that's been, on the front page now, which hunger almost never gets on the front page. And you look at all these things and realize this is no time to be messing with the farmers of your country. Like, this is no time to be letting somebody come in and steal farm equipment or destroying traditional methods of. I mean, they were destroying irrigation schemes, traditional ways of plowing fields, even when they don't have tractors, killing draft oxen. I mean, this type of thing, this type of warfare, which when the Germans and the French are coming over and say, "Hey, all is forgiven." I mean, I know they're not saying that explicitly, but that seems to be the underlying context: is when can we start doing business again? When can we be friends again? When can we turn the clock back to 2018? How quickly can this happen? When they overlook all of these crimes that are being committed, how can they do that with any confidence in the fact that the next 6 months, or the next even 3 months, is not going to see them in the same situation, looking at the same type of crimes against humanity, the same types of war crimes that they were seeing with Tigray? And are they prepared to stop economic activity again? I mean, because Europe, I mean, they may be pushing to restart the thing, but if things happen, if news stories come out, if Human Rights Watch reports come out, Amnesty International, then they'll stop again. But this has to be a bad investment at this point. This relationship has to be a bad investment, and it's been made a bad investment because of the way the international community has ignored some of these crimes. And to Faisal's point about how to reconcile the hero image, like the idea of the Tigrayan fighter, and to try to reconcile the soldiers or the militia in Ethiopia who were used by the Ethiopian government to terrorize the people of Tigray. We have seen how that works. We've seen how it works in places like Yemen, places like Pakistan, places like Afghanistan. The United States has supported this type of stuff before. Other countries have supported this type of stuff. One of the reasons why Yemen is in a really bad situation is because when they came back from Afghanistan, they sent them to fight their own enemies. These things get out of hand very quickly. Fano, the extremist group, the ethnic extremist group that's been terrorizing people in Tigray and Oromia, I think it was a very big missed opportunity when you're talking about a cessation of hostilities, when you're talking about a disarmament, to not include them, to not include the militias, to not include some of the regional forces in that disarmament. That needed to happen for Ethiopia to be a peaceful country. Places, a militia like Fano, they have to go. And for them to come back as heroes after the devastation that they've unleashed in Tigray is a very, very difficult situation, because now that is, this gets attached to masculinity. This gets attached to this hero image, or this, these brave kids were out there, terrorizing farmers in Tigray. That doesn't go away. You don't go back to being, a college student after that as easily as one would hope. There needs to be reintegration. There needs to be disarmament immediately, because this is not a tool they can keep relying on. And if they are still going to rely on that, the places like Europe and the United States and international partners, they should stay away, because this is going to flare up again, and it's going to be worse, and it's going to be stop and go and creating cycles of violence that don't end very easily. And I think everybody should keep that in mind. Everybody in particularly in Europe, who are trying to rehabilitate, they should definitely keep this in mind.
Great. Thank you, Doc, for that. I think that gives me a segue to my last question and your final thoughts as well. By the way, because we are on satellite as well in the Horn of Africa, we are limited by time. I wish, I have all the time to talk to every aspect with all of you. So the question is, what should be done in terms of Addis Ababa, Asmara, and Bahar Dar as well to keep what has started in Tigray in earnest in terms of peace building, but also, dealing with what is happening in Oromia and now in Somali region as well. So Faisal, can you speak to that as well? Yeah, I think maybe you mentioned about what's happening in very close to Jigjiga. Maybe you want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with both that siege, and I mentioned that in my article, siege is probably difficult on Oromia because of its proximity and border with Somalis, Afar, Kenya, many Sidama. So, and then siege in Oromia could bring it down the economy. Now, this week, you write the irony of how hollow the system of governance in Ethiopia is. Mustafa was ordered to welcome a team of Somalis who visited Tigray under the rubric of helping reconstruction, and he hosted because he had a government order. This is the same guy who was pumping, the only Somali, to my knowledge, who was really hitting the trumpet for the genocide war. There was no single Somali, in my opinion, who was participant to the genocide war except him, not because he was supporting Abiy, but he has a close affinity with the ultra Amhara nationalists such as Fano, people like, they even visited in the middle of the war. And when Oromo war was about to start in that Harar area, he invited 3-4 well-known Fano members. And with that, I would like to use this opportunity to highlight what's happening in Jijiga area for the last 1 week. Because of a dam that's proposed by PP Oromia government in the Somali region without any consultation, just displacing 30,000 people in a place that's 8 kilometers only from Jijiga. It is creating a havoc. The last 3 days, there have been conflict between the Fatno PP Oromia police who are very well equipped and well armed, and Somali clan called the Geri clan. And today, the number I get there are about 10 casualties on the Somali side and 18 wounded. It's a devastating. And how did we get to this? One, I think it has a diversionary kind of tactic, because as Skayal said, the Oromo war is expanding. It's a way to occupy the minds of Eastern Oromo who are supporters of Ola, to give their attention and create another enemy out of nothing, that's Somali. The essence is a fight over what EPRDF did in 2004. I wrote an article at the time called Somalis, you ANC nothing yet. And I was saying that resizing the Somali regional state and creating conflict between Somalis and their Charso brothers who have lived together for 200 years is a recipe for a conflict that will not end. And I said the new map that divided Ethiopia into several regions at the time is now being revisited, and that's in 2004. And a sample episode that was taken at the time, which EPRDF OPDO masterminded, literally set the tone for a perpetual creation of animosity between Somalis and Eastern Oromo, the two closest people in the Ethiopian map, who have affinity, who have intermarried, who have probably for many years been together. So I think what we see today and the conflict that you see today is the tranquil, as I said here, if any civil strife arises, it would arise on the basis of what they have created in 2004. So the conflict that you see today was created way back in 2004. Prior to that, I wrote an article, and I think what they did was they created a system where the Eastern Oromo and Somalis in that area will always be in a perpetual conflict. This was by design by EPRDF. What had happened then is now showing as fruit, and the war is taking place on the outskirts of Jigjiga. It's really, these are two people or two groups that should never fight. My theory, now I see the damage and the fact that Mustafa Akbar will never say a thing, because Somalis always joke and say that even if he's asked to hand his wife and mother over in order to keep his seat, he will do that. And so up to this point, he hasn't said anything, whereas Shimalis is really trampling on civilian peasant Somali. The area is displacing 30,000 people. It will also damage the water sustainability of Jigjiga as a city and the entire region, because this is the watershed that really, feeds into the river that goes all the way down to the Ogaden. There has not been consultation. This is also the field where Abiy visited 2 months ago, called wheat field. Yes, it's a very fertile field. It has been one of the most successful in the 1970s World Bank agribusiness projects, because my father comes from that area, so I know the area very well. I think it has both a past and a present dynamics. I think the past is what I described. The present is basically to ensure that Harar and Eastern Oromo masses not pay attention to the struggle, the legitimate struggle that Ola is making. And there has always been this factor in Ethiopia. Whenever the Oromos are supposed to be used either to divert their attention from a legitimate struggle that they are waging, or, Somalis are always made the enemy. OPDO did this all the time when OLF was fighting. PP is doing the same time. And I think that the script is very well written, and Skayas talked about how the war is now expanding, not only into Arsi and Bale, but also in some parts of Harar. And one way to really slow down Ola's movement is to create a faint enemy out of Somalis. And that's exactly what's happening. So instead of PP working to strengthen the brotherly relationship between Somalis and Oromos, it is using this in the same way that they used between Amaras and Tigray, although the dynamics and the nature is different, in the sense that Somalis and Oromos haven't had any really serious conflict except camaraderie. One last thing I like to add: there is a fear that if the Ola war gets stronger in the eastern portion, the siege will not be possible. I think weapons and gas and benzene and fuel could easily be coming from Somalis by Oromos and Ola aligning itself with Somali traders all the way from Moyale to Jiga. And one way to kill that is to create this conflict, and that's what they are doing.
Thank you, Faisal, for that. I think that gives a good understanding of what has been happening in the past and how it plays out today. Skel, you can speak to that if you will, to the video I was showing with Burhanu Jula. But again, my question is the same. How do you see anything we do externally from the international office, or I mean, the community, or internally within Ethiopia, how to pressure Asmara, Addis Ababa, and Bahar Dar to end what's happening in different parts of Ethiopia?
First of all, I agree with Faisal that one way the PP government could stay in power is by sowing seeds of conflict between communities. And Shimelis is probably doing exactly that between Somali and the Oromo communities to preempt a possibility that the Oromo Liberation Army could start operations in the east, in the Hararge area. And if they do, by the way, if they do, and that's exactly what I was meaning when I say Western Hararge, in the Karamile, in the Machara area, that is the area that had already been historically the stronghold of the OLA. Now, we can talk about structural causation, about why civil war in Ethiopia. We can talk about that if we wanted to. Maybe the constitution, the design of the multinational federation, all kinds of structural factors could be the reason, and maybe negotiations within Ethiopia could resolve the national dialogue, could resolve the political differences, and peace might prevail again. All of those problems existed under Haile Mariam Desalegn, under Meles, and even before. All of those problems existed, but it did not rise to the conflicts. Did not rise to the level of genocide and indescribable level of cruelty. We haven't seen that. Why is that the case? That's the question that should be asked. When Burhanu Jula is saying that only the Oromia regional forces were engaging the OLA, he is lying. I mean, I can tell him from the days that the ENDF, actually he himself announced, this man himself announced that the ENDF is going to Western Oromia. We saw that, and that's what when I talked about, and he comes out saying that that was not the case. That's the problem in Ethiopia. The country is led by people who have difficulty with the truth. And as long as there is they have difficulty with truth, that they cannot keep their words. That is why when you sign agreements with them, you cannot hope that that agreement could hold. You know, Ethiopia is today led by a leader accused of committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and possibly genocide. Only in Ethiopia would a leader who invited foreign troops to commit atrocity crimes against the compatriots of that country and allowed violation of the country's sovereignty would be viewed as a legitimate leader. Under the Prosperity Party, Ethiopia must be considered an international pariah, not a country that you could resume business with as if nothing happened. What I am saying is that the difficulties in Ethiopia defies solution now. The problems in Ethiopia cannot defy solution. National dialogue cannot resolve it from within Ethiopia, and this man is not going to do that either. And the international community is not offended, not at least sufficiently offended by what happened in Tigray, in Kemant, in Oromia, and everywhere in Ethiopia. And they're not terrified by what might happen, what is going to unfold in that country. They're not terrified by it. Otherwise, European foreign ministers in a country where genocide was possibly committed, they go back and shake hands, the bloody hands of the prime minister. So if a national solution cannot resolve the complex and complicated problems of that country, if the international community is not considering this an international pariah and cannot that the rest of the international community cannot do business with, well, then I don't know where solutions could come. But my point is, the war started, as I say, deliberately when two men agreed to fight a war against their opponents. Abiy went along because he feared the TPLF. Isaias went with this project with speed and gusto because he wanted revenge. It is that simple. It's a voluntarist causation. It is not a structural causation. It's a voluntarist causation, the agential causation that a pact of two men did that actually start now playing out havoc in the Horn of Africa. So it's very difficult to imagine the salvation for Ethiopia comes from within or from the international community, from the behavior of the international community that I see right now, and from the behavior of the powers that be in Ethiopia. It's a very difficult time for me to hope for better days.
Thank you, Professor Eskel, for that. Duke, how do you see, again, even in the first segment, you mentioned about how they should see it for what it is, and they should do something before, again, another round of genocide flares up in Tigray and what's happening in other parts of Ethiopia. So where do you see the hope? Because we are talking about war, and there is that peace signed, and there has been a lot of push from Tigrayans, at least, for the Tigrayan authorities to be transparent about what has been signed for. And even if the agreement says concurrently, Tigray seems to just leave that out and do their part, including handing the heavy weapons in the town of Agula. What is your take on what might play out? Because Tigray authorities, based on EMD media's contact with them, they seem to account for the fact that if they can do their own share, there will be international community, the African Union, including the monitoring and verification mechanism, would push for Addis to do its part in pushing out Eritrea.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to just agree with what's been said already, but it really does get to that point where if and just speaking about the international community at this point, if they're unwilling to, it's like Lucy in the football. If they're unwilling to see what's happening with the, statements and going back on it, it's hard to write about what's going on in Ethiopia, because what I was trying to find an article where it said that there would be immediate resumption of humanitarian assistance. I found about 6 articles that said that, and they were all throughout the past 2 years. And for Antonio Gutierrez, if he comes out again to say that food is going to be restarted somewhere and it's not, I don't know how many times he's going to be willing to just come out there and say, hey, guess what? They told me everything was going to be okay. And then 2 days later, you find out that there's no more trucks moving. If we continue to treat things that are going on in Ethiopia as if it's not a big problem if civilians are getting killed, sometimes civilians have to get killed to make peace or whatever the horrible calculation is there, then the international community is always going to be a negative influence with the Prosperity Party in power, because that's what they need. That's what they need from. They don't need our guns. They don't need all they need from the international community, for the prime minister and for the Prosperity Party, is for us to keep believing the lies that are being told to us, to keep rewarding half measures and very minor victories, to keep rewarding these, when he reduces the scope of weaponized starvation, which is a horrible thing to even think about. As long as we're willing to play this game, it's going to benefit a very small group of people in Ethiopia, and it's going to not benefit the entire country of Ethiopia. And for the Department of State not to see that, not to see where this is going, for other people not to see, Europe and the UK and everybody not to see where this is going, is criminal at this point, because there's not going to be a way to contain the next war, the next conflict in Ethiopia once it gets started. They know that they're not able to do that, and so it has to be prevented. If the international community is going to do anything, it has to be to prevent these things rather than to try to respond to them. And it doesn't look like they have any ability to do that, any capacity to really see where this is going. And that's a new situation. I mean, we're in a new day for America if this is going to be our posture. This is going to be our stated posture, that we are going to overlook massive civilian casualties. Now, this is not to say that America has not been involved in conflicts that have created civilian casualties, or hasn't been partnered with countries that kill their own people, that oppress their own people. We've done all that. We have. It hasn't gone very well. It hasn't helped us as a country. And I only say that from the American side. Europe, it hasn't helped them either. But to continue to do this in Ethiopia is not going to there's not going to be any positive implications for Ethiopia. It's going to be bad. The only people that are going to benefit is the Prosperity Party and whoever replaces them, because this is going to happen. This is going to happen, I would imagine, sooner rather than later. We're going to be talking about the new administration. If this continues, they need the war to maintain support for the prime minister. This is a game that a lot of leaders play. Donald Trump did this in a different sense, not as far as going to war, but in demonizing one person, playing one people off the next. That can keep you in power for a while, but sooner or later that gets out of hand. It gets beyond what you can control. And if the United States, if the State Department can't see the writing on the wall with that, then it's going to keep fueling discord in Ethiopia, conflict in Ethiopia. And the most horrible part about this is the brutality of the conflicts that are happening. These are impacting civilians first. These are impacting civilians most. Nobody is paying the price more than civilians in Ethiopia. And that's not just Tigray. I mean, this significantly has been paid for by Tigray, but it's also the entire northern Ethiopia region, the entire area of Oromia. These places, this is where civilians are paying for the conflicts, even more so than they are in other places. And this is just a business that the United States does not want to be a part of. This is the equivalent to this would be if we backed Assad once the situation was happening in Syria. If we backed Gaddafi, if we backed some of these people that nobody would have considered backing. I mean, I was about to say Saddam Hussein, but we did when he was fighting against the Iranians. But we should have learned our lesson from all of these. All of these lessons saw authoritarian regimes that were friendly to the United States, that we were friendly towards, fall, collapse. And what came after that was chaos. And the United States need to understand their role in that is not just as an observer. You can't just turn it off and turn it on like that, where, at one point you're an active player, you're an influential player, you're helping propel Abiy to the prime ministership. and then the next moment you're just standing back saying, hey, well, we're not gonna get involved. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The people have a memory of what's happening. We've heard for the past 2 years that the TPLF has been a puppet of the United States government, primarily because the United States had some relationship with the TPLF when they were in charge of Ethiopia. They're going to look at the Prosperity Party as a puppet of the American government. Some people are already doing that. It's not going to go well. So the United States needs to change their course. I don't know about the international community, the European Union, the UN. I don't know what it's going to take for them, but the United States certainly needs to change their course.
Thank you.
If I may make a quick comment on the delegation that came to Addis and my reflection on that, please.
Yes, you do that just a moment, because they are asking for your article again. So I just want to say that Faisal's article is pinned on UMD Media's YouTube channel. So if you go up, you should be able to find it. So we have pinned that based on the request, and they were asking for this quotation as well, where it came from. It's from the same article. It's Faisal Rovla who said, taking punitive measures against civilians is as Ethiopian as their injera is. So I just want to mention that. Go ahead, Faisal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's connected to that comment. I think what is happening is we are forgetting our history when we are confronted with a punitive government in Ethiopia. We have to go back to the 1960s and 70s, when the world and the West in particular know Ethiopia as Haile Selassie's country. And that concept still exists. And as Duke was saying and Scale was saying, I think there is this attachment to the Addis Ababa government, no matter what they do, whatever mistakes. This is not the first time. It happened when Somalis were blockaded, although it's not as severe as the one in Tigray. It happened many times. I think what we forget is our history. When the government doesn't listen and the world doesn't see our viewpoint, we then went to the jungles and fought back. I think what happened is intellectually we get bankrupted to a point where we give our political grievance to be addressed by Washington and Paris and what have you, and they don't. When you have people like Mori Fay, who is sitting in the State Department Africa Bureau, who openly says, and I think I mentioned this about 6 months ago, 7 months ago, who said, we like Abiy. And I tried to correct her and I said, do you mean Ethiopia? That much. This is when the war was at its worst. So I think a lesson to be learned here is do we need to really farm out and outsource our rights to be negotiated between a punitive government in Aret Kilo, no matter who is the presiding? It could be Malas, it could be Abiy, it could be Mengistu Haile Mariam or Haile Selassie, between them and Washington, Paris, the Western power corridors, and sometimes, the East. Or we just come and really pressure the government by any means necessary to a point where, we are heard. I think we are not being heard. I think those ministers that went to Addis Ababa, I think, our octogenarian president, Biden, sitting with Abiy and watching the soccer at the worst time of the war, when 60 million people were, dying because of hunger, and the food that he even donated could not reach them. I think it looks like we have forgotten our history, and we put too much faith in the hands of Washington, D.C. and Paris and German towns. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Faisal. Thank you, Duke, Faisal, and Scale, who just left for another commitment. And the new time and day for the weekly H panel is Sundays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Please tune in, and thank you for your insight today, gentlemen, and good night. You've been following us live on our channel on UMD Media, their weekly H panel, and on satellite under Horn Broadcasting Services on Yasat. Thank you for your viewership. Please, as you leave, like, subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, share, please, so that many can reach our material. Good night from here. Bye.